Hi, welcome to part 3. We are in module 3, and in this part we are focused on how do you determine the instructional platform for intensive intervention. And so probably not surprisingly, our objective for this part of module 3 is to figure out how to develop the instructional platform for intensive intervention. So let's go ahead and get started here. So here is our intensive intervention framework. And we've talked through this framework, and right now I want to focus on this part up here, which I like to refer to as the instructional platform. This is our jumping off point for delivering good mathematics instruction for students that are having difficulty with mathematics. And so in fact, I'm going to cover up the rest of our framework so that we can just focus on this part here to focus on the instructional platform. Now, before I start talking about the instructional platform, I will say that there is a really good article about the instructional platform and intensive intervention in mathematics. And I say it's really good because it might be that I was one of the authors of this article. But here it talks about how do you plan for intensive intervention, how do you implement intensive intervention, and then how do you monitor your intensive intervention to make sure that it's working for the students that you want it to work with. So that's a nice reading if you want to check it out, but let's go ahead and go back and think about our instructional platform. Now, the first thing that we want to do when we're thinking about developing our instructional platform is we want to conduct a diagnostic of student strengths and weaknesses. Now, we've already talked a little bit about diagnostic, so some of this might be a review. Now here we have our DBI framework right here. And you'll notice that it says diagnostic. And in the DBI framework, we typically conduct that diagnostic after students have showed that they're having trouble with the learning mathematics and that they aren't making the progress that we would like them to make. But I want to convince you that it might also be important to conduct a diagnostic up here so that you can develop a really strong intervention program for the students. So I'm going to go ahead and stand up and kind of cover up our framework as we talk about these diagnostics here. Now, a diagnostic assessment is something that occurs before or during learning. So for us, that's very appropriate. I'm asking us to do this before we kick off our intensive intervention. And a good diagnostic is going to measure multiple areas of mathematics. So you should see a diagnostic that might assess understanding related to number and operations, geometry, measurement, algebra, and data analysis. Those are some very common strands of mathematics learning that we ask students to have competency with. And in that diagnostic, once you administer it to a student, it should provide you a really detailed score profile. So it won't just say, oh, Sarah, she's good at math. It will say, well, here's where Sarah scores in terms of number and operations. It might even dive deeper to say, here are Sarah's scores related to addition versus multiplication versus understanding of fractions. Then it'll tell me about geometry, and it could just give an overall geometry score, but maybe it does a deep dive into two-dimensional understanding and three-dimensional understanding. And I think you get the gist here, but it's really digging deep into where does the student have strengths in mathematics and where does the student have weaknesses in mathematics. Now, another type of assessment that you might want to use to help inform your scope and sequence within your instructional platform is formative assessments. And we talked a lot about that in Module 2. But with formative assessments, we can do things like error analyses, and we can look at error patterns to understand where students might need the most instruction from us. And you can also sometimes rely on summative assessments, especially if these have been administered recently to students. I wouldn't look at summative data that's more than a year old for kids, but let's say maybe it's the fall and you have some state testing data that was gathered in April or May of the previous school year. That might be good data to bring in to help us understand where the students' strengths and weaknesses lie in mathematics, so that can help us out with the instructional platform. Now, also in terms of thinking about the content for intensive intervention and where we want to start, I kind of mentioned this with formative assessments, but you may want to conduct some formal error analyses. So for example, let's say I have this problem here, and I'm going to grab one of my markers real quick and let's say as a student I add 7 plus 3 and I write my 0 right there, and then I just add 4 plus 7 and I write a 1, and then 5 plus 6 is 11. So if I answer a problem something like this, it is not correct, and I could do an error analysis to figure out, well, where are the mistakes that the student is making? Here I could see that the student has a pretty weak understanding of what does it mean to regroup, and so in terms of my intervention platform, I might want to put in some really good place value and regrouping instruction so that that helps the student out there. Now I'm going to erase my incorrect answer. I always want to emphasize that that was answered incorrectly, so you think that I know how to do some math problems. But also in terms of developing our scope and sequence, you want to think about that continuum of math learning. We did an activity with that where we placed different standards on the continuum of math learning. And if you'll remember, when I was talking about that, we said that every student's continuum is going to be a little bit different based on students' strengths and weaknesses. So maybe you want to review the continuum of math learning for the student or students that you are designing the intervention platform for. All right, so we've done number 1. We've talked about the first thing that we want to do is to conduct a diagnostic to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a student. And then we want to develop the scope and sequence for the students with this knowledge that we've gained from this diagnostic. Now, remember the scope and sequence, it does look something like this. Here's where we want our student to be, but here's where our student is. And so now we need to figure out what is the continuum of math for the student so that this will be the content that we teach in intensive intervention. We don't want to just take a set of standards and just apply them. We want to apply the continuum of mathematics learning so that it helps students fill in foundational gaps where they have weaknesses in math. And remember the continuum of math learning, if I am focused on problem solving, like in this example, you're going to bring in a lot of other math skills as well. So for example, here I might talk about addition and subtraction and the properties of multiplication and division. We might also want to bring in some work on understanding place value. So here are some of the standards that are related to that. We also always want to help students with fluency. That's going to make everything in math that we do that much easier. So we'll go ahead and bring in some of our fluency standards, and there we have our continuum of math learning for a student in the elementary grades. So thinking about that instructional platform, we first talked about doing a diagnostic. Remember, that can be formal or informal or a combination of the two. Then we design the scope and sequence. So we go back to some of that information we talked about in Module 1, and we provide a really good scope and sequence for the student based on the student's needs. And then we identify the instructional platform. What are we gonna do to help this student learn math? And as we've talked about previously, we want to rely on evidence-based interventions, but when those aren't available, we can rely on our evidence-based strategies. So I'm going to show you this umbrella. Hopefully it looks a little bit familiar to you. Remember, we've got this umbrella term of evidence-based practices, and our first go-to is an evidence-based intervention. That's a nice packaged intervention. It's all put together for us, and we can just use it, and we know it has a strong evidence base. When that's not available, we can rely on an evidence-based strategy. And sometimes you might use several evidence-based strategies. But these are strategies that have been shown to be effective for students when they have learning difficulties in mathematics. And then if that's not available, we can rely on promising practices. These are strategies that might only have one or two studies that have shown promise, but that's always better than having something that has no evidence or negative evidence. That would be a big no-no. Now, where do we find these evidence-based practices? You know, a lot of times we like to go to the research and read different articles or books that tell us about this. You may also do some internet searches, so there's some good resources resources out there. There are websites that have already looked at the research and put it together for us in a nice, manageable way. And then you can also use word of mouth, what other people tell you, but I would say it's best to rely on these top resources better than just what somebody's telling you from afar. Now, we've talked about our instructional platform, all right? So here's an example. We've conducted a diagnostic of this student, and whoops, I've got to put up my things here. This student here is Esri, and she's a 4th grade student. And so when we've conducted the diagnostic of Esri, we see the following results from the diagnostic. Now, the first thing you'll see about this diagnostic is that it surveyed a variety of areas in mathematics, and that's a good thing. Now remember, Esri is a 4th grade student, and just for this example, just to kind of like quickly look at this, we looked at grade equivalencies, all right? So when I think about Esri's fact fluency, I see that she's performing probably early 2nd grade level in fact fluency. And that's really problematic because remember, fact fluency is going to help solve all other problems in math. And so this is one of the areas, I'll go ahead and circle it here if I can. This is one of the areas that I would like to incorporate in Esri's intensive intervention. I also look at her computation score. That looks quite worrisome. So I'd also like to provide some work on computation. Problem solving looks not great, but you know what? This one right here worries me, especially for Esri being a 4th grade student. Her fraction score is quite low. Oh man, I'm not good at drawing circles today. Wow, that's okay. But this just shows me that I want to focus for Esri on fact fluency, computation, and fractions. And I think that's going to give her a very strong foundation to help remediate some of her math difficulties. And then I'm going to see, just kind of continue to see how she does with geometry, measurement, and data analysis. And probably I'm going to incorporate a little bit of problem solving instruction within her intensive intervention. But right now, I'm going to focus on these big 3 things. So with this example, you can see how the diagnostic helps inform the content of the intensive intervention. Now I'll erase my circles, and we'll keep those 3 with us, so fact fluency, computation, and fractions, as we then design the scope and sequence. So let's say I want Esri to be here in terms of her fraction knowledge, so understanding what a fraction means and that it has equal parts and that type of thing. I also want Esri to help me I don't want Esri to help me, I want to help Esri. I want to help Esri understand equivalent fractions as well. But what is the scope and sequence that gets me to this point right here? Well, let's see. I am going to probably want to think about some of that addition and subtraction knowledge that where Esri showed some difficulty. So I'll put that with addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. I want to help build Esri's fluency, as we talked about, and I want to help her do computation problems here within word problem solving. So then all of this whole number work will then transition into hopefully a stronger understanding of fractions. So with that, we designed a scope and sequence for Esri. And then it's time to identify the instructional platform for her. So here I want to rely on those evidence-based interventions, and if that's not available, I want to rely on the evidence-based strategy. So I'm going to go to the website intensiveintervention.org. And there I can look through their tools charts to see which interventions have a nice, strong evidence base. And I noticed this one here called Fraction Face-Off, which that might be a good one because remember, Esri needs some practice with fractions. So then I look at Fraction Face-Off and it has a nice introduction to the concepts of fractions. I also see throughout here that she will be practicing word problem solving within fractions. So then I choose Fraction Face-Off as my evidence-based intervention that I'm going to use within my instructional platform for Esri. But I also may want to rely on some evidence-based strategies, so I would also like to bring in some fluency flashcard practice. That has a nice evidence base in the area of mathematics for kids with learning difficulties. So then in this way, I can have an evidence-based intervention and supplement it with an evidence-based strategy to really help Esri with those 3 things: fact fluency, computation, and fractions. So now it's time to look at workbook activity number 5. Now remember, you met our friend Emma just a little bit earlier. I think we saw her in module 2. And we want to think about Emma's mathematical strengths and weaknesses, and those are actually laid out for you within this activity. And so based on the information in the activity, I want you to answer these two questions. Number one, what would be a scope and sequence for Emma? And then number two, what evidence-based interventions or evidence-based strategies are available? So I hope you had a nice time with that workbook activity. Here's where we are. So just to review, we talked about our instructional platform. This is at the top of the intensive intervention framework. Now, the instructional platform asks you to conduct a diagnostic, so figure out where students have strengths and weaknesses, then design a scope and sequence based on the weaknesses that the student needs the most help on. And then after you develop that scope and sequence, figure out what your instructional platform is going to be. Is it going to be an evidence-based intervention? Is it going to be an evidence-based strategy or some combination of those? Because then you want to figure out how you're going to teach that scope and sequence that you've just outlined. And then as we implement the instructional platform, then we start to think about the rest of our intensive intervention framework. So then we'll progress monitor the instructional platform. We'll decide whether students are showing good response or response that's not great. And then remember, when the response isn't great, we conduct a formal diagnostic again, make adaptations, and then progress monitor those adaptations. Now I'd like you to think about workbook activity number 6. And so using the resources that we've discussed in this module and some of the previous modules, and also thinking about the resources that you already have available to you in your school, I'd like you to think about what evidence-based interventions and evidence-based strategies are available at the grade level or perhaps grade levels that you support. And what is the quality of this evidence? So I'd like you to do a deep dive into the evidence. Now, I hope you had a fun time with workbook activity number 6. It's now time to review our checklist for part 3 of module 3. So how do you determine the instructional platform for intensive intervention? Well, let's focus on these 3 things. First, conduct a diagnostic of the student. Second, identify the scope and sequence for instruction. And third, identify those evidence-based practices, either evidence-based interventions or evidence-based strategies that we are going to use. Now, your final assignment for this activity is the discussion board. So what evidence-based practices do you need for intensive intervention? I'd like you to go ahead and share that with your classmates.